The first cold of the season arrived the way it often did now, not as a door slamming shut, but as a hand that couldn't decide whether to let go. In the subarctic foothills, where spruce forests thinned into open tundra and the ground rose into low, stony ridges, night temperatures slid below freezing, then climbed back above it by midday. The ponds skimmed with glassy ice at dawn and turned to black water again by afternoon. Wet snow fell in soft sheets, then melted into cold rain that ran down the moss and pooled in the tire ruts of old seismic roads. People who lived here had a phrase for the boundary where winter almost began. The freeze line. It wasn't drawn on any map. It moved with cloud cover and wind. It could sit on a valley for 3 days, then lift and drift uphill like smoke. And that year, the freeze line kept moving. A Wolverine crossed it before sunrise. He came out of the spruce like a shadow thickened into muscle, low to the ground but not crouched, moving with a steady, workmanlike trot. His paws were wide for his size, the fur between his toes thick, built for floating over soft snow and carrying him over crusted drifts. His coat was dark chocolate along the back, with pale blonde stripes running from his shoulders to his hips, like a river splitting around a rock. Frost clung to his whiskers. He was a male, full-grown, heavy in the shoulders. He travelled alone. Wolverines did that most of the time, not because they were lonely, but because the land demanded it. The distances were too large, the meals too uncertain. He moved along a creek where alder branches arched over the water. In summer it would be noisy, full of insects and silt and the quick flash of grayling. Now it was quiet, half frozen and half running, the surface patched with ice so thin it sagged under its own weight. He stopped and sniffed at a place where the bank was torn open, the mud clawed. Moose tracks, big, deep, splayed, had punched through the wet ground. But there was something else too, the faint, sharp smell of blood, not fresh, not old, carried up from downstream. The Wolverine stood for a moment without moving, letting the air tell him what his eyes could not. Then he turned and followed the creek. 30 miles away, in a small research cabin that had once been a trapper's shelter, a woman named Mara Lavoie poured coffee into an enamel mug and watched the weather through a window filmed with frost. The cabin sat on the edge of a wide basin where willow and dwarf birch grew in low tangles. A ridge rose behind it, and beyond the ridge the land rolled away into a series of frozen lakes and rounded hills. The place was quiet enough that you could hear the wind decide which direction it wanted to blow. Mara worked for a wildlife research program that had started with caribou collaring and had expanded year by year into a broader study of how animals moved when the seasons became unreliable. The funding came in bursts. Some years they had enough to fly weekly, some years they were lucky to keep the generator running. She had arrived 2 weeks earlier with a graduate student named Cal and a local field technician named Jonah Kallock. Jonah was Inuk, from a coastal community to the north. He had hunted with his uncle since he was a teenager and had spent enough winters on the land to understand it without needing graphs. He also understood Mara's work well enough to help her do it. On the table lay a cluster of GPS units, spare batteries, and a laptop with a map open on the screen. Coloured lines traced the movements of collared animals. Caribou, wolves, and 2 wolverines tagged the previous spring. Mara leaned over the laptop and tapped the track labelled W07. "Look at this," she said. Cal rubbed sleep from his eyes and stepped closer. "He's moving fast." Jonah sipped his coffee and stared at the screen without blinking. "He's following the slush," he said. Mara looked up. "The slush?" Jonah nodded toward the window, toward the basin where the snow had tried to settle and failed. "Freeze line. It's not stable this year. Ice makes a skin, then breaks. Animals fall through, or they get stuck, or they can't dig. Easy meals for something like him." Cal frowned. "You mean scavenging?" "Scavenging," Jonah agreed, "and maybe hunting, but mostly scavenging. Wolverine doesn't waste energy if he doesn't have to." Mara watched the line on the map, the tight arcs and long straight pushes. Wolverines were famous for covering insane distances. People told stories about them as if they were monsters, but Mara had learned to think of them as relentless accountants of calories, always measuring, always deciding. The collar pinged again, updating the location. W07 was headed toward their basin. The Wolverine reached a shallow lake by mid-morning. It looked frozen from a distance, white with snow, wind-scuffed, quiet. But as he stepped onto it, the snow gave underfoot in a way that wasn't right. The surface sagged, and a dark sheen rose through the powder. He froze, weight balanced, every muscle alert. Then he backed off the lake and circled along the shoreline, testing with each step, choosing ground that held. Near the far end of the lake, something lay half buried in the snow. He approached slowly. It was a caribou, or what was left of one, legs stiff, belly torn, hide peeled back. The ribs were clean in places, gnawed white. The carcass had been there long enough for ravens to work on it, long enough for foxes to take what they could reach. But there was still meat along the spine, and fat under the skin where the cold had preserved it. The Wolverine climbed onto the carcass and began to eat. He did not tear wildly. He worked with method. His jaws were built for crushing. He could break frozen bone. He could bite through hide stiff as leather. He ate until his belly rounded, then stopped and lifted his head. The wind shifted. A human smell drifted across the lake, faint, mixed with smoke and fuel, carried by the cold air from far away. The Wolverine held still, listening. There were no voices, no engines. Just the wind, the distant crack of ice flexing under its own weight, and the slow drip of meltwater somewhere beneath the snow. The Wolverine did what Wolverines did. He made a decision and committed to it. He dragged the caribou carcass off the lake, inch by inch, teeth sunk into hide, shoulders straining. It was heavy. It was awkward. But the shoreline was safer than the slush-covered ice, and he did not like to lose food. By the time he reached the willows, snow had begun to fall again, soft and wet, the kind that stuck to fur and weighed down branches. He pulled the carcass into a tangle of brush and began to cache it, covering it with snow and leaves, pressing it down with his paws. Wolverines were famous for stealing from others. They were also famous for hiding what they found. A good cache could feed an animal for days. When he was done, he turned and moved on, back toward the shifting freeze line, back toward wherever the land offered the next opportunity. That afternoon, Mara, Cal, and Jonah stepped outside the cabin with antennae and receivers. The air smelled of damp snow. The clouds hung low over the ridge. Somewhere nearby, a raven called. Cal lifted the antenna and swept it in a slow arc. The receiver beeped, quiet at first, then louder. "Got him," Cal said, excitement sharpening his voice. Jonah pointed. "He's in the willows, down near the lake." Mara pulled her hood tighter and started walking. They moved carefully, not because they feared the Wolverine would attack. Wolverines avoided people when they could, but because they didn't want to push him away from whatever he was doing. Mara wanted to see his choices, not force new ones. As they approached the lake, the ground softened underfoot. The snow here was wet and heavy. Beneath it, the earth was half frozen, like bread left too long in the freezer. Cal stopped and crouched beside a set of tracks. "Big," he whispered. Mara knelt beside him. The prints were round and wide, the toes faintly visible in the slushy snow. The stride was long. The animal had moved with purpose. Jonah scanned the willows. "He's here," Jonah said softly. Or he was. They followed the tracks into the brush. The smell hit them first. Rich, metallic, unmistakable. Cal made a sound in his throat. Caribou. Mara pushed aside a branch and saw the torn hide, the white ribs, the half-buried spine. The cache was fresh. Snow had been scraped over it with deliberate movements. "He dragged this," Mara said, half to herself. Jonah nodded. "He won't leave it far. He'll come back." Mara looked around, imagining the Wolverine watching them from somewhere unseen, his dark eyes fixed on their hands, their movements, their intentions. "We should get out of here," Jonah said. Let him have it. Mara hesitated only a moment. Then she stood. As they walked back toward the cabin, Cal kept glancing over his shoulder. It's strange, he said. Seeing it like this, the map line turns into this. Mara nodded. That's why we're here, she said. Behind them, the willows swayed under the wet snow, and the freeze line shifted again, almost imperceptibly, like a living thing. 2 days later, the temperature rose above freezing. Rain fell on snow, and the world changed texture. The basin became a sponge. Water ran beneath the surface, turning the snowpack into something that looked solid but behaved like slush. Lakes that should have locked into hard ice stayed soft at the edges. Creek crossings became dangerous. The kind of winter travel that people relied on, snow machine trails, frozen rivers, lake shortcuts, wasn't reliable. The Wolverine felt it in his feet. He climbed higher, away from the basin, toward ground that held its shape. He moved along a ridge where wind had scoured the snow down to crust and exposed rock. From there he could see a patchwork, dark spruce, pale tundra, and the reflective skin of half-frozen water. The freeze line lay below him, in the valleys. It was a band of uncertainty, and uncertainty meant opportunity. At the edge of the ridge, a line of tracks cut across the snow. Wolf tracks, several animals, moving together, their paws neat and direct. They had passed recently. The snow in the prints had not yet glazed over. The Wolverine lowered his head and sniffed. Wolves meant a possibility of a kill. Wolves also meant danger. A pack could drive a Wolverine away from a carcass if it wanted to, but Wolverines did not fear much the way other animals did. They calculated. He followed. That same morning, a bush plane landed on a rough strip of snow-packed ground near the research cabin. The engine roared, then went quiet, leaving a ringing silence behind it. A man climbed out and stretched, his boots crunching. He wore a worn parka and a headset hanging around his neck. His name was Eddie Tkachuk, and he flew supplies and people to places like this because he was good at it, and because he liked the feeling of distance. He unloaded fuel, mail, and a small crate of fresh food, apples, onions, bread. Mara signed a clipboard with stiff fingers. Eddie glanced toward the basin. "Weather's weird," he said. Mara gave a humorless laugh. "That's one way to put it." Eddie nodded toward the laptop inside the cabin, visible through the window. "You still tracking that Wolverine?" Mara looked at him sharply. "How'd you know?" Eddie shrugged. "Jonah told me last week over the radio. Said you got a big mail moving through." Jonah stepped out behind Mara, carrying a jerry can. "He's close," Jonah said. Eddie raised his eyebrows. "Close like might steal my lunch close?" Jonah smiled slightly. "Close like he's using the same valleys we use." Eddie's smile faded. "That freeze line's bad for flying too," he said. "Fog sits right on it, and if the lakes don't bind, you don't get safe emergency landing spots." Mara watched the clouds. They were low and moving fast, like a curtain being dragged across the hills. "You headed back out today?" she asked. Eddie shook his head. "Not until tomorrow. I'll sit tight in town. But you, watch your travel. People fall through this time of year. Doesn't matter if you've lived here forever." Jonah nodded. "We know." Eddie climbed back into his plane and fired the engine. The prop wash kicked up wet snow and slapped it against Mara's legs. The plane lifted into the grey sky and vanished into cloud. Mara stood for a moment, feeling the damp cold soak into her boots. Then she turned back inside, where the laptop waited with its moving lines. The wolves found a moose. It wasn't dramatic in the way people imagined predator scenes. There was no cinematic chase across open snow. There was slow pressure, long tracking, exhaustion as a weapon. The moose was young, not a calf but not fully grown, and the crusted snow slowed it. Each time it tried to break through a drift, it sank and had to wrench itself free. The wolves, 6 of them, moved around it like a current, testing, pushing, taking bites when they could. When the moose finally went down, it was because its legs gave out. The Wolverine arrived hours later when the wolves had eaten and moved off to rest. He approached the kill site cautiously, nose high, reading the air. Wolf scent was thick here, layered over blood and stomach contents and the sharp smell of torn pine. Ravens had already begun to circle, dropping in with cautious hops to steal scraps. The Wolverine didn't rush. He circled once, twice, testing the wind for any sign the wolves were still nearby. Then he stepped in and began to feed. Moose meat was dense, heavy with calories. The Wolverine tore into it with the efficiency of an animal that knew winter could still close its fist. He ate until his sides expanded. Then he did something that made ravens lift off in a sudden black explosion. He grabbed a chunk of meat and dragged it away from the carcass. Wolverines could not carry entire moose the way wolves could dismantle them, but they could steal and they could store. They made the landscape into a pantry. He dragged the meat toward a patch of boulders where snow lay deep in the shade. He scraped a hole, shoved the meat in, packed snow over it, and pressed it down with his paws until it was sealed. Then he returned for more. Mara saw the wolves cluster on her map first. The collars on 2 wolves in the local pack had been deployed years earlier, and the research program still received intermittent pings when the batteries allowed. That morning, 2 wolf points had stayed close together in a tight area, indicating a stop. "A kill," Mara said quietly. Cal leaned over her shoulder. "Moose?" he guessed. "Probably," Mara said. Caribou would be moved more. Jonah watched the screen, then pointed at another line. "Wolverine's going there." Mara's pulse quickened. "He's going to scavenge." Cal grinned. "Can we go see it?" Jonah's grin didn't match Cal's. "We can," he said, "but we need to be careful. Wolves don't like surprises, and ice is bad right now." Mara hesitated, then nodded. "We'll go on foot. Stay off the lakes. Keep to the ridge." They packed quickly. Radio, bear spray, standard even in winter, extra layers, a small first aid kit. They did not bring weapons. Mara had grown up around hunters, but did not hunt herself. Jonah carried a small rifle sometimes, depending on where they were going, but today he left it behind. The wolves were not the problem. The ground was. They started out under a ceiling of grey cloud. The farther they walked, the more the snow turned to slush. In low areas, water pooled under the surface, and each step made a wet, sucking sound. On exposed ridges, the wind had hardened the snow into crust that held their weight. They moved slowly, choosing each foot placement. Cal, who had grown up in a city far to the south, watched Jonah's feet as if they were a lesson. "Is it always like this?" Cal asked. Jonah shook his head. "No, used to be more predictable. You could read the land and trust it. Now, you read it and still you test." Mara listened, filing the words away with the quiet ache that had become familiar, the sense that the old rules were loosening. They reached the kill site late in the afternoon. They smelled it before they saw it. The moose lay in a shallow depression, half covered with snow that had fallen after the kill. Its belly was torn open, ribs exposed. Wolf tracks churned the area into a mess of prints. Raven tracks stitched the edges, and Wolverine tracks, big, wide, cut in and out like punctuation marks. Cal crouched, eyes wide. He was here. Mara scanned the trees. He might still be. Jonah touched Mara's sleeve and pointed. A dark shape moved at the edge of the boulders, low and deliberate. The Wolverine. He was not close, maybe 50 yards away, but he was visible, his coat stark against the snow. He paused, head lifted, eyes on them. For a moment, the world held still. 3 humans standing in wet snow, 1 Wolverine half hidden among rocks, ravens watching from trees like silent judges. Then the Wolverine turned and trotted away, not panicked, not rushed, just gone, as if he had decided the cost of staying was higher than the benefit. Cal let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That was intense. Mara watched the line of his tracks fade into the trees. "He'll come back," she said softly. "When we leave." Jonah nodded. "He always does."